Welcome to the Austin Public Library podcast. My name is Julie Kleinfelter, Director of the Public Library in Austin, Minnesota, and I'm here with my co-host, Michael Verde, for the 8th podcast of our Reading for Life program. Reading for Life is a movement of the imagination for the purpose of growing community around a shared love of literature. Structured like a book group, but one facilitated to maintain the richest possible dialogue among the participants and the source text, the presentations bridge great novels to dedicated readers. The idea is that real community begins and ends with our imaginations, and few resources, if any, are as vital to the imagination's development as works of literature. Our unofficial tagline for the program is 8 podcasts, 4 books, and you. Today, we are wrapping up Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Michael, I can't believe we are already on podcast 8. Like that 8 podcasts and 4 books went pretty quick.
It did, and it's been a real buzz, and I appreciate folks that have gotten into it, and it's turned out to be kind of a real adventure in the imagination as we hoped it would be. The books have not let us down, so I'm just tickled. It seems like yesterday, there's two sort of worlds here. There's real clock time, and then it seems like the imagination exists in another sort of time. So when I say it seems like time flies, for instance, and this is a very apropos conversation given Love in the Time of Cholera, it seems like a couple of different ways to think about time. One, that it's going click, 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 and it goes around and around in a circle. Another way to think about time is the way that musicians work with time to give it a form so that it's not simply circular and repetitive. In other words, you take this the rhythm and you start playing around with the rhythms, and the next thing you know, it seems like you've turned time into something, you've transfigured time into something that just doesn't go around and around and around in a circle. I'm saying the circle business because repetition is a big thing to Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Yeah. And breaking out of repetition is breaking out of clock time. So in other words, when I say that it seems like time flies, or it was a long time ago or yesterday, I think there is that feeling because when you enter into the world of the imagination, you're in a separate universe altogether where clock time no longer prevails. You could give a pedestrian example. You could say when you fall in love and you're talking with somebody, at the end of the conversation, you could say, it felt like just 2 seconds when we started talking. I mean, everyone knows when you fall in the, or you're just having a really, really good conversation, something happens, and the next thing you know, oh my God, we've been here 4 hours. So what is that feeling and why does it happen? And I'm suggesting that when the imagination goes to work with time, that it turns it into something that is not simply relegated to the natural cycle. And I'm saying the natural cycle because it's a big repetition too. Things eat things, and then those things die, and then new things are born. And the circle of life, in other words, just goes round and round and round. If our existence as human beings was absolutely circumscribed by the circle of life, then there would ultimately be no point for our life except that we were going to die and some other human being was going to be born, and it would be just as meaningless, if you see what I mean. So you could say at the beginning of literature, starting with Gilgamesh, you could say, in one sense, the imagination finds it death unacceptable. And at some deep level, poetry exists to defy the circle of time. Can I create something that actually lifts out of, that breaks out of that circle so that it exists in a dimension of existence in which death does not prevail? So that was a long way of saying that it seems like we just started, because in certain instances, I think we've got a little buzz among us that brought us out of the regular, quote unquote, real world. So anyway, let's talk about it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting way to look at not only this book in particular, but all 4 of the books kind of in general had a sense of that as well, I think.
Here's something that blows people's mind when they deal with it, and it's hard to, if you think about, let's say all fiction, you think, oh my God, there's 3 million books of fiction out there. You think 3 million different books. Well, that's partly true. But if you imagine that you were talking about, I don't know, numbers and math, and there's all these people doing math around the world, and there's all these different kind of math. Well, yes and no, because all those people are working with numbers in the same way. In other words, all these people doing math are coming up with answers and equations that other people would discover too, which is to say, all those numbers have a kind of reality that unifies them in a certain way so that it's not just randomly what happens. There is, in other words, these numbers have a reality related to numbers that keeps them unified. So if you're doing numbers in Paraguay or if you're doing numbers in Texas, you're going to, okay, same thing with these books. These are a bunch of different books, but they're dealing with a common verbal universe. So in some sense, there's total diversity, and yet all of those books are going back to a common kind of, let's say, fountain. They're coming out of a source that brings a certain unity there. So when you say we've discussed this with all the books, yes, because these are core themes of literature, and to a certain extent, all of the verbal universe, when it is used imaginatively, is in this same struggle against the finitude of our existence. So, in other words, all literature exists to break out of this circle, to break out of death, the natural cycle of death.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about when people join this Reading for Life group and start to and pick up the new novel. What are some of, like, how do we read like that? How do we read a little deeper than just at a surface level?
Great. Here's a simple version. Let's say you're going to a museum and you're going to look at paintings, and you go up to the first painting and it's a Picasso, and the lady has like three noses. And let's say that let's make it interesting. Let's say you move to Paris, you fall in love with someone, and she's going to introduce you to art. Let's say you're from a place where you've never been exposed to art before, really. Not, I mean, there's pictures of deer, let's say, over your fireplace. Okay, and that's what you know about art. You go to Paris, you fall in love with this girl, she invites you to the Musée Picasso. You want to impress her. You go to the Musée Picasso. She showed you some paintings that she loves, and the first woman has three noses, and you say, "Oh my God, you're trying to be witty. I could paint that. I think Picasso needs to go back to art school and practice because I see three noses." And you think you're being funny, and she thinks you're a Philistine. Now, what's going on here? You're saying that this painting is not a good painting because people in reality only have one nose. And you're judging this painting because you think a painting should reproduce the quote unquote real world. And that's what makes a painting good. If it is lifelike, it's a good painting. And then here we are in the 20th century exposed to all this art that is not lifelike. Now, what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is that artists and painters are not agreeing that the basis of beauty is the quote unquote real world. There is another world for artists. And in the world of painting, that world has to do with shapes and figures and colors. And that is itself a real world. And if the painting comes alive in the world of painting, then it is a powerful work of art. It's not trying to reproduce the real world. Another simple way to say this, if you go to a museum and you see this framed picture on the wall, you're trying to say, does this picture move me? There's two ways you can do it. You can say, is this really like life? You're looking at Monet's lilies and you think, I've never really seen that, but they look green. These look pink. So then the painting fails. Another way is to let go of the quote unquote real world as the basis of how I'm going to make sense of this painting, and then begin to participate with the painting in its own language, its own vocabulary. Now you're dealing with shapes and lights in the composition, and you're not judging it based on what's outside of the frame. You're judging it on how it moves you into that frame so that the real world behind you disappears and you find yourself living in another kind of world that is, as far as imagination concerned, even more real than the one in the museum. So how does that apply to books? Well, you can sit there and read the book and say, is this really like life? And say, well, this isn't like life. I don't think this is a very good story. I mean, think about magical surrealism or magical realism, rather, with Marquez, when he has, these incredible things where people are drinking perfume, as in Love in the Time of Cholera, eating flowers, and you go, that's not realistic. People can't really eat flowers. Okay, you're clearly just like the guy at the Musée Picasso making fun of Picasso's three noses. You're judging this book if it's like real world. These words are a real world. So you can either read the words to correspond to what's off the page, or you can accept the proposal that these words make a reality that is not judged by what they point to, but it is judged by the way they work together and come together to create an alternative kind of universe. So you could say the first way of reading to what points off the page is reading by correspondence. Do these words represent something that are not words? The other way of reading, you could call it reading the validity by coherence. How do these words come together as a, let's say, a little unity? So then the words mean in relationship to the other words, not to what's off the page, relationship to the other words. So then you notice one word on page 4. How does this word on page 4 have to do with all of these other words in this book? And it's, like that game with cards. I think it's concentration or something. You turn all the cards face down, you turn over, you see a 4. Where's the other 4? Well, if you start to do this with words in a novel, you will see that these words start to link up with each other in all kinds of interesting patterns. And the next thing you know, you are seeing that these words constellate into a structure. There's a shape that's formed. And because it's that spatial, that it also moves in time. A narrative, page 1, so it's moving. So like music, it moves in time. Like sculpture, it moves in space. And the next thing you know, you have a shape that's moving in time. And if they're a really, really great artist, that shape comes alive. And the next thing you know, you could have a kind of relationship with that shape. Now, why am I saying this about relationship with what happens with the words? The epigraph in Love in a Time of Cholera says that these words have their own crown goddess also. Now, in the novel, the crown goddess is Fermina, and it's also the name of a waltz that Florentino writes in honor. He falls in love. He creates a waltz that he's going to serenade Fermina with. He names this waltz the crown goddess because when he sees her at some point, she looks like a crown goddess. Now, let's go back to the epigraph. These words have their own crown goddess also. Now, what he's saying, in other words, is that these words have fallen in love with something. Just like the Florentino falls in love with Fermina, these words have fallen in love with something. And what these words are falling in love with is, you could call it the muse, but it's another way of saying, I wrote this book so that it will be like the waltz. You see what I mean? We got a parallel. I wrote this waltz for Fermina, but I wrote this book for another kind of lover. And I want that lover, this is a muse now, I want that lover to wed me. And this is another way of saying that these artists are in a struggle against death. They're trying to create something so real that a reality from another universe moves into these words and lifts them out of the natural cycle into something like eternity. And this gets back to our deal with time. And in this particular novel, you can say that love is like cholera, because this is one of the insights that his uncle has. He can see the symptoms when Florentino falls in love and how sick he is, and they think he may have cholera. And then it dawns on his uncle that the symptoms of cholera are like the symptoms of love. Now, what's going on? This is Love in a Time of Cholera. Well, cholera kills you, or could, but this novel suggestion maybe love can kill you too. But the difference might be that the way love kills you, there's only one part of you dead. That's your previous sense of reality, so that you could be resurrected. In other words, after the death of love, you can rise again because you still are physically alive, but your consciousness has changed forever. Because now that you've fallen in love, whatever happens when you fall in love, I think people agree, is that it warps your sense of things. So somebody that everybody in the world thinks is homely, if you fall in love with that person, that'll be the most beautiful person in the world. Well, what's going on? That person has been transfigured. The eyes of love, in other words, see things differently. And if you ever see that with the eyes of love, no one can convince you that you're having an illusion. It may seem like an illusion to them, but you know what I'm seeing now is more real than the way I looked at the world when I was not in love. So what I'm saying is that love can kill you, but what it's killing is your ego. It's killing your previous sense of self. And once that sense of self dies, another sense of self comes alive. And this, now you're in a very different world. Now, what I just described really is the beginning of this book. When Florentino falls in love, a part of him dies. Whatever destiny he had before he saw Fermina, well, that destiny's over. And now that he's fallen in love and he has seen the reality of of this new kind of world, this is the world he lives for the rest of the novel. And he is a saint for this world. Now you can contrast that with Urbina, with juvenile Urbina, who has not fallen in love. So he lives back in the real world. And guess what he's going to do? He's going to get rid of death. He's not going to die by getting rid of all the things that are in this that cause cholera. You're going to get rid of all the toxins. In other words, he's also trying not, he's not going to die either, but he's not going to die by getting rid of all the things that can possibly kill you. But this is not how Florentino's not going to die. He's not going to die because he's no longer in that world at all. He's not in the circle of nature. That's why he's not going to die. Dr. Juvenile Urbino's not going to die because he's going to cure the circle of nature and get rid of all the toxins, all the things that are impure. He's going to get rid of them, and he's going to live forever in a state of purity. If you see what I mean, these are two kinds of ways to defeat death. You can defeat death by getting rid of all the diseases and keep trying to live longer and longer and longer. So now that we live 250 years, okay, or you can defeat death by falling in love and leaving the world in which your biological death is the end of your existence, because it's not the end of your existence because a part of you ain't even there anymore. Every work of art that's great is working at this particular level for a very simple reason. This is the reality that we are all facing as human beings. I mentioned Gilgamesh, the very first work of literature. I think there was one other, but it's typically considered the first work of literature. This is about this. Gilgamesh falls in love with a wild man in Keto, who in Keto gets civilized by having sex with a woman. She teaches him about love. Gilgamesh was like an arrogant king, and he was cruel to everybody. And so the gods got tired of it, and they need to do something about him. So they make this little wild creature called Enkidu, who's like completely like Caliban in The Tempest. And then Enkidu, to get civilized, he falls in love. And in other words, it's like, you're like a boorish kid in junior high, and you don't really care if you shower every night or not. And then you fall in love, and the next thing you know, you're worried about every one of your curls, and you're getting stuff for your pimples. Because now you're kind of semi-civilized, and for the first time, you're acting decent at the table at your own house because you don't want to embarrass your girlfriend. So anyway, Enkidu is a different. He goes to Gilgamesh, and they have a struggle. Gilgamesh defeats him in this struggle, but he becomes best friends with Enkidu. And he loves this Enkidu character. And then Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh can't bear it. He can't live without Enkidu. So he goes to a wise man and says, this death, what can I do about it? And there are certain trials that if he succeeds in these trials, he can have immortal life. And in one of these trials, he needs to go get this plant at the bottom of the water, that if he can get this plant up to the surface and somehow take whatever, he's going to live forever. But before he gets the plant, now he's going down, he gets the plant, and he's coming back up, but snakes eat the plant before he can get it out of water. Now think about just for a second, the old man in the sea. The old man gets this fish, the great fish. He's bringing it in to the kid that he loves. But before he can get it to shore, the sharks eat it to death. They eat up all the meat. Okay, and I'm saying this story, the old man in the sea. The sea, you could say, is the sea of time. It's love in the time of cholera. It takes place on the river Magdalena. Here's the old man. He's the big fish. What's the big fish? For the poet, the big fish is immortality. To land the big fish is to write the novel that will catapult your beingness outside of the circle of time. This is why why these guys are doing it is the same way that you and I are doing it in different ways. How are we trying not to die? A lot of people say, well, I'll put my name on a building. Okay, that's one way not to die. In other words, I'm going to symbolically defeat nature by having my name be recognized forever. Or other people are trying to live forever. I don't know what it's called, where they freeze your brain and then they're going to wake up. Okay, so in one sense, Carl Jung said, I've never had a patient after 40 whose real problem was not the fear of death. that as we start to confront our own mortality, however much we repress it, it starts to bedevil us. We start to, and people can do mad things when they're looking at their own. I mean, you could, this is maybe a too timely of an example to make, but people think, well, Putin, there's something wrong with him. He has some kind of cancer. What's going on with him? And now, what is the next thing you know? He has to conquer Ukraine and reclaim the Soviet Empire. Well, here's a guy that is looking at mortality, and he's going to change existence before he dies so that he's immortal. And look what it. Okay, so I'm saying that in a way, we all have immortality projects, and so does a poet. But a poet goes about defeating death by creating something that'll never die.
What's interesting, and I find it ironic that I think in this day and age, and again, maybe this is from a librarian's point of view, I think people find it harder and harder to find the time to sit and read the books.
There you
and
go.
What you and I have talked about is that you need to read these books not just once, but twice or three times. And I feel like in modern society that the attention spans are shrinking. And do we have the ability to sit and sustain the reading that we need to be able to have these longer thoughts and these deeper, it's kind of an interesting, and maybe it's always been, when they went from oral histories to paper, I'm sure there was concern about how that was going to do it. So maybe this is just that next iteration of that, but it does seem like an irony.
What you just described is two different ways of looking at time. Dr. Juvenal Urbino, who is so busy with all of his projects. He's over all the civic things. He's over all the medical things. He's at the forefront of every public assembly. Okay, he's a very busy man. But guess what? At the moment of his death, after he's tried to reach his parrot and has taken a fall, he's going to not die by getting rid of all the toxins, and he absurdly dies by trying to reach a parrot at the top of a ladder. Okay, so he's about to die. His wife, Fermina, runs to us, and before, what is his last words? Only God knows how much I loved you. Which means then he was so busy doing so many things that he never took the time to even tell his wife that he loved her. Now, but compare that to Florentino. His entire time that he has goes to love. He dresses like someone from like a monk. He's relatively speaking poor. He's kind of on the outskirts. In other words, he took all of his time and spent it on love. This other guy took all of his time and spent it on, I'm not going to die and I'm going to be famous. And at the end of life, you might say, Dr. Juvenal Urbino didn't break out of the cycle of death, and perhaps Florentino did. So you can, there's decisions to be made here. My little brother's a personal trainer, and he's a great personal trainer. And he can do remarkable things to people that come to him that want to transform any number of things, their health or the way they look or whatever. But one of the things that makes him great as a personal trainer is that very early in this project that you fantasized about, he makes it clear to you that it's a choice. Mm-hmm. It's a choice. And that there's no shortcuts to this choice. And once he gets people to make that choice, well, then things sort of change. Well, this is the same deal here with respect to our time and love. It's a choice. There's no sort of shortcut to it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And guess what? The marketplace may not really care about your eternity. The marketplace might really need, because money goes round and round in a circle. So the mall needs your money. So if the mall can convince you that you're not lovable unless you buy these new pairs of tennis shoes, and you believe it, then the next thing you know, you're going to be living to buy those tennis shoes, which means you're going to be living for money. Mm-hmm. So this is what I mean about love can kill your identity. If you fall in love with somebody and really fall in love with them, you may not think that your identity depends on those tennis shoes. You might think that your identity depends on whether that person loves you back or not, and then in other words, you got a different sense of what makes me me. You got a different sense, and you're not playing the mall. It's not mall money time. You're in a different time now. And what I'm saying is you have a different sense of who I am and what makes me what. You're in a separate, different universe. And at the end of near the end of the novel, when Florentino invites Fermina to take a cruise with him on the river, Magdalena, and she says, "I'm too old. Why would I want to do that?" And he knows that he has to convince her that love is the alpha and omega, and which is to say, love is its own meaning. There's no reason for it whatsoever. It is the reason. It is the alpha and omega. It is not, and it's not a means to another end. It is the end. This is the end. In other words, all of those other things, what's the point of them? If it doesn't,
it really does make, I mean, again, this book in particular, I think is one, I definitely need to go back and read again, because there was so much going on the first time that it's hard to keep up with. And there's so much there. There's so much there.
And if you fall in love with a book, then going back and rereading it will be deepening your love. In other words, here's a paradox. When you reread it, it will become new in a new way. So you won't be rereading the book because the book is not the book will be changing and growing, and the intensity, therefore, of the relationship is growing. If you fell in love with someone, you would not say, we had a great lunch, but you would want to just keep eating lunch with that person every day. You wouldn't even want to stop lunch because that person would never get old. Now, if you're not in love with that person, it might get old before lunch is over. So when we talk about rereading a book, there's a way that that's true and a way that it's not. Because if you fall in love in the book, it's not going to be the same book. We're not in circle time anymore.
Yeah. Interesting.
And you can believe that great writers, okay, they're great readers, and what does Florentino do throughout the novel? He reads incessantly. Okay, he reads everything, but he reads everything because it burns him up. He's in it so deeply. So what I'm saying is, when you fall in love with a work of art, it's never going to get old. If it's a great work of art, it's never going to get old. You won't exhaust it, because the more your imagination comes alive, the more those words will come alive. In a way, it's sort of sad. Think about serial dating. Okay, I've never done it, but I think there's these things where, like, you can go and, like, there's a bunch of people and you sit down and you do 5 minutes, and then you go the next one, you do 5 minutes. Okay, well, think about that. Maybe that's fun. Maybe it works. I don't know. I don't know anything about love in the real world. Well, I mean, I've done all the dumb things as everybody else does. But if you imagine that, I mean, people go to therapy when they have this issue. That they can't commit to anything, so they're just chasing bodies all over the world. Well, you can make analogies with reading like that. And it might be what the therapist might say to you is, well, you're not really experiencing love with any of these people. You're actually running from intimacy. And you're going to keep doing that because you're not going to get what you're looking for. What you're really looking for, though you may not believe it. Now think about the unbearable lightness of being. This is exactly what that book is about. This is the guy that's having multiple affairs, right? He's going around and because he wants to not get heavy. He wants to keep it light. He wants to be mobile. So he's just keeping having these different affairs. Well, we're talking about the same kind of thing right here. At some point, that lightness of staying, that's not, you never go under, to fall in love, you got to get heavy, because you got to commit. Next thing you know, you have a child. Well, that's a commitment. But here's the irony. It's only through that route that you're going to experience what you think you're going to find by going around and around. Now, I'm using this lightness. Think about what does Dr. Juvenile Urbino do. One of his big trips is on a hot air balloon. And he's going to go up, and he's the first person to do everything, because this is one of the things, if you're in the wealth and you're whatever, the top of the pyramid. Okay, a hot air balloon, that is going up. But what does Fermina's name mean? It means earth, terra firma. And what is everything about Florentino have to do with dying. First, he thinks that the Spanish galleon's under the water. That he thinks he's dead himself. Okay. So in other words, you can say the doctor tried to go up without ever coming down. To come down is to get heavy. To come down is to commit yourself to something real in the earth. This is what with Florentino, his first love affair, she finally decides this was all an illusion. Why? Because all of these love letters you're sending me, that's really wonderful, but I don't know if you know me. You don't really know me. And I don't want you to be falling in love with an image you have of me. You might be falling in love with your own imagination. I want you to fall in love with me. Okay, so everything about Fermina, it has to do with reality, with the real world. And in a sense, Florentino, who has this amazing imagination, he has to learn about reality, and he has to combine his imagination with nature. That's another way you could say a failing is that you don't engage with the natural cycle. In other words, you want to keep it all make believe. Well, that's another way of not living forever. Yep. You've got
the two extremes.
There you go, the two extremes. You've got to go all the way to reality. You got to go out on the other side of reality. You can't avoid reality. And you can see that in these two characters, because in a way, Dr. Juvenal Urbino is avoiding a certain kind of death, the death of falling in love. He in this reality, science won't get him to. See, everything about him has to do with science, but this doesn't make sense to science. This is another kind of subtext of this novel, is what's more illusory, love or this reason without love? Which is going to get us to reality? And then, in other words, this is something we're all dealing with. Why is all literature about this is what we're talking about, because we're all having to decide that. Which of these things is illusory? Which of these things is the real world? And there is a real struggle going on, and poets are not neutral.
Yeah, interesting. And I was thinking too, when you were talking about how rereading a book, you know, the story is different every time because, you know, but I've heard a lot of people say, oh, I wish I could go back and read my favorite books for the first time again.
Well, you will, because you will have changed.
Right. Which I think that's an interesting point, is that every time you reread it, you will have changed. So the story will be different. So it will almost be like reading.
Absolutely. And partly the reason you'll change is because of what the story did. Mm-hmm. And that's why the story will change too. Heraclitus said you can't step in the same river twice. Just right. Fascinating. Why? Because after your left foot goes down, it won't be the same river that the left foot went into, because now it's the river with the left foot. So when your right foot goes in the river, it's a different river than with the left foot. That's that kind of dialectic. But what's going on in this back and forth? This is the word from the novel. Both the book and the reader are being transfigured. That means their figure or their form or their shape is being transformed. You can take water. What is water? Well, that depends. What's the heat? If it's real cold, then water's ice. If it's normal temperature, then it's water. But if it's real hot, what is it? It's steam. Mm-hmm. So what water is depends on the intensity of the heat. Well, you can say that's the same thing with the human being. What we are has something to do with the heat of the imagination. And at a certain degree of intensity, this gets us all to the Great Gatsby, incidentally, but with a certain degree of intensity of heat, then the human being is transfigured. It takes another form, and it's this form that I'm suggesting that defies the limits of nature.
Interesting. So interesting.
Well, it adds the stakes. You know, sometimes when I'm in bookstores, there's an independent bookstore, I won't name it, that I'm in, and it's really hilarious because the bookstore lady is the one that everyone comes to, and they say, "What should I read next? I'm going to Cancun." And then and I'm thinking to myself, this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. There people think that these books are like a different pair of socks or something, and what should I wear because the season has changed and I'm going to be at Cancun. I didn't get a good book for Cancun. What does that even mean? How can I have a good book for Cancun? This is a real sense that, folks, you don't understand why this bookstore exists, really.
Well, and that's why I always say, if someone asks me, to suggest a book to them, I have to kind of say, are you ready for that conversation? Because we need to have a conversation first before I can even begin to maybe give you a recommendation about something that you might want, if
That's
you're honestly asking me for my recommendation, or if you just want, something that's like the latest, James Patterson, then I can get you that too. But
well, that suggests to me that these books mean something to your life.
Mhm.
And if someone asks you that, well, how serious do you want to be? Which is very different than keeping up with the latest thing. So you can, these people got to read these books to keep up with talking with each other. Guess what? They're competing with each other. This is just like juvenile urbino. They're competing with each other in a social game.
Mhm.
And I'm not gonna mention the demographic of this bookstore, but I'll just throw this out there. This particular bookstore, and I'm just using it because it relates to the book, because Florentino is a poor man. Okay, he's
Yes.
repeatedly described. He's a poor man. Well, this particular bookstore universes is that people end up competing with each other in a kind of pyramid of status. And the next thing you know, that you spend your whole life trying to get to the top of some kind of social ladder. Now, this explains why juvenile albino dies at the top of a ladder reaching for a parrot, because it's making fun of the Tower of Babel, which is going to reach God. Man is going to build a tower to God, and he's going to put himself on God's throne. In other words, this is a project of going up and usurping the source of life. Man is going to put himself, and what does God do to frustrate him? He changes their languages so that they can't understand each other. So they're all talking in babble. I'm saying this because this novel begins with Pentecost. When this novel begins, it's the day of Pentecost. When Jeremiah St. Amour dies and when Juvenile Albino dies, it is the day of Pentecost. Pentecost is the opposite of the Tower of Babel, because Pentecost is when the Spirit comes down to man. It's not man going up to take over God. This is God sending down the Spirit, and the Spirit inflames all of the people at Pentecost, the apostles. They're born with a holy fire. And then when they speak, no matter what language they speak, they understand each other. This is the absolute opposite of the Tower of Babel, if you see what I mean. So what I'm suggesting here is that there is a way of communicating that carries with it a spirit that you've wedded to, that is transfigured your own existence now, so that you are having a kind of communion that normal speech can't reach. This is when you say speaking in tongues. Now people, they're beyond normal speech. This is another kind of speech. This is what all poets have experienced.
Mhm.
They've experienced this. So this goes back to your first question. How do you participate in this not normal speech? Well, the first thing you do is you quit saying these words are meaningful if they point to the real world, because guess what? These words are not trying to point to the real world. They're trying to point to a world that is more real than the real world. And the proof that it's more real is in the world that you're headed to, death won't get the last word. That's why it's more real than the real world. But you got to learn to speak another language. And the first way you're going to do is start to appreciate that these words have a meaning within their own reality, their own universe. So make sense of the painting with what's in the frame. Don't compare it with what's outside of the frame. So now you're noticing the painting in a new way. This tree is over here. This color is over here. Before you were saying, what does that color have to do with what's outside of the frame? Now you're comparing that color to what's inside the frame. This goes back to your first, how do you read like that? You read by saying, you know what? I'm going to take what's inside the frame as real, and I'm going to start to learn what it's saying without telling it. It needs to replicate what I already know.
Hmm.
Does that make sense here? This is the analogy.
I think so.
I got to quit reading these words and telling them, you will be meaningful to me if you reproduce what I already know.
Sure. You have to stop using what you know and what you think in your ego and come at it with kind of a fresh canvas.
And here's the proof for the freshness. What is Pentecost? This novel, I'm giving an example. This novel begins with Pentecost. What does that have to do with what's at the end of this novel? In other words, you're taking things within the novel and comparing them to each other. Going back to that card game concentration. This is how you're taking what's inside the frame seriously. You're saying this word Pentecost is not pointing to the Pentecost off the page, except symbolically. What does it have to do with other words? What is this idea of fire coming down that it affects somebody so that they can speak in a different, okay, well, why is Florentino, okay, why is Florentino in the park of the Evangels? Okay, why is it that that he is inflamed with a kind of fire, the kind of fire that's burned away his one sense of reality now? What does fire have to do with gold? Well, I'm going to the end of the novel. They're going to El Dorado. Okay. I'm taking the image of fire and saying, what does it have to do with gold? Well, gold goes into the fire and the fire burns away everything that's not pure gold. But guess what? It also makes the gold eternally because it's burned off everything that's not what's okay. So at the end of the novel, in a way, what's happening is the natural world and all of those toxins that Juvenile Urbino was going to get rid of, they're being burned away through the fire of love. And what is eternal is passing. And this is another way of not dying. You you are you're speaking a language that death can't understand. And that's another way of describing poetry. Okay, poetry is a language that death can't understand. But you got to
So,
start. But you, okay, a poem doesn't point to anything. I want to get back to something very concrete.
yeah.
If you read a poem and say this doesn't make sense because it's not realistic, you have a fundamental misunderstanding of how poetry works. Okay, take that same analogy and apply it to a novel. Okay, apply it to a novel. And that's how you begin to read differently. Begin to read this novel like it was a poem.
So those are some good tips on what to do, which leads us to, obviously you and I enjoy this. A lot of these conversations have been kind of at least partially between just you and I, and we obviously enjoy this. And it has been surprising how quickly this has gone, which just goes to the point that we've enjoyed it. So the plan is to do this again with 4 new books. And so part of this conversation hopefully will encourage our listeners to pick up one of these or all of these next 4 books and get them read, maybe more than once, or if they've read them before, read them again, so that we can move on and do this again. And because for those who are listening, and they're going to get the super secret first chance to hear what those 4 books are for our reading point, Reading for Life 2.0 for the next year. We have Where the Crawdad Sings by Delia Owens, The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller, and The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. So
I'm excited.
Hopefully, I'm excited too. I'm hoping that everybody else who's listening will be excited. And as we get this information out, people will pick these books up and read them and think about them deeply and write all over them and mark them up as long as they're not library books, and come back and meet with us again as we kind of work through, reading with that kind of blank slate and not having those expectations.
Wonderful. And there's almost certainly there are people who are hearing this that are excited about this because they love to read. And that you can take that word love very seriously. They are just experiencing something when they read that is more real than the real world. And those are the people who are hearing what we're saying right now and saying, oh my God, that works for me. Those people are out there. And we can close, for at least in my part of this, by saying my deepest intuition is that libraries exist for those people. That if you were to think about a temple or a cathedral dedicated to the imagination, I can't think what a library is if it's not a temple dedicated to the imagination, and that there are acolytes and disciples of this religion. And I'm being playful here, but we can close by saying Love in the Time of Cholera is doing the same kind of play, because you see all kind of religious imagery everywhere, from the Pentecost, the Park of the Evangels, where he dresses like a monk. But guess what? This is not a religion to get to heaven by being good and not sinning. This is a different call, the call of eros, not agape. It's a different kind of eternity. So in one sense, he's using biblical imagery, but in another sense, he's saying, listen, if you think eternity has something to do with not sinning on this earth, and then when you die, coming alive in another place, well, you might be right and I might be wrong, but my eternity is going to be experienced right here through falling in love with a real blooded a human being. And so when I say that there's a kind of temple here, I mean, not that it's like a religion, but that is the imagination is a spiritual movement. That's why we're reading for life here.
For sure. So for all you book lovers out there, reading lovers, stick with us and we will hopefully chat with you soon about these next 4 books. Michael, thank you so much and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you.